The Copperleaf was the kind of restaurant where the candles on each table cost more than Emma Hartwell earned in a single shift. It sat on the corner of 5th Avenue and 61st Street in Manhattan, wrapped in dark oak paneling and soft amber light, the sort of place where voices were kept low and ambitions were kept high. The silverware was polished every morning by hand. The menu had no prices. Emma had worked there for 11 months, and in that time she had learned to move like smoke through a room. Present enough to serve, but absent enough not to be noticed. That was the job. That was survival. She tied her apron in the staff corridor just before 6 in the evening, checked that her name tag was straight, and pulled her dark hair into a knot at the back of her neck. Patricia Wren appeared beside her, already dressed and already talking. "Table 9 is yours tonight," Patricia said, pulling on her jacket. Gerald flagged it as priority. 2 Americans, 1 German. Some kind of corporate thing. Big wine order, separate check, the usual drama. "How many courses?" Emma asked. "Love 'em," Patricia said, and disappeared toward the dining room before Emma could ask anything else. Emma exhaled and picked up her tray. Table 9 was positioned in the far left corner of the main dining room, tucked behind a partition of frosted glass that gave it a sense of privacy without full separation. She approached from the side, carrying a basket of warm bread and a carafe of still water, and she heard it before she saw the men seated there. German. One of them was speaking in German, and the sound of it moved through Emma's chest like something ancient waking up. She did not slow her pace. She kept her expression steady and her shoulders level. But inside, something shifted the way it does when a door opens in a dark house and light pours through a crack that has been sealed for years. She placed the basket on the table without a word. 3 men sat before her. The first was broad-shouldered with dark eyes and silver at his temples, wearing a charcoal suit that fitted him with the kind of precision that money bought without effort. He sat at the head of the table with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. Emma did not know his name yet, but she would later learn it was Robert Calloway, the founder and CEO of Calloway Industries, a man who had built a logistics empire from a single warehouse in New Jersey at the age of 26 and had never once stopped moving since. To Robert's right sat a lean man in his mid-30s with glossy hair and a narrow smile. He held a leather folder in one hand and gestured with the other as he spoke. There was something practiced about him, something rehearsed in the way he tilted his head and nodded. Emma had served enough tables in enough expensive rooms to recognize a performance when she saw one. This man was performing. The third man was the German speaker. His name, she would learn, was Felix Bauer, a manufacturing executive from Munich who had flown in specifically for this meeting. He was perhaps 50. With close-cropped gray hair and the kind of weathered face that belonged to someone who had spent decades working rather than posturing. When he spoke plainly, without decoration, the way Germans often did in business settings. Valuing clarity over charm, the lean man with the narrow smile was Gregory Sloane, and he was the translator. Emma filled the water glasses and stepped back. She had been trained to become part of the background at this stage of a meal, to check in silently, to refill without being asked, to be useful without being visible. She returned to the service station 15 feet from table 9 and began arranging dessert forks. But her ears stayed locked on that corner of the room with a focus she could not have explained to anyone. Felix Bauer was speaking again. His German was formal but direct. He was talking about the terms of a supply contract, specifically about delivery timelines and the penalty clauses that govern delays. He said the numbers in the draft agreement differed from the numbers discussed in their previous correspondence. He said the penalty figure had been increased without his agreement, and that he wanted this corrected before any conversation about signing could take place. It was a reasonable statement. It was not aggressive. It was the kind of observation that any serious businessman would make when, reading a contract carefully before committing to it. Gregory Sloane listened with his practiced tilt of the head and then turned to Robert. "Says the delivery framework looks solid," Gregory said smoothly. "He's impressed by the structure your legal team put together. He'd like to keep the momentum going." Emma set down the fork she was holding. She set it down slowly with great care because her hand had begun to shake. Felix had said nothing of the sort. Felix had raised a specific and significant objection about altered penalty figures. Gregory had converted that objection into a compliment. He had taken a concern and dressed it as enthusiasm. And neither Robert Calloway nor Felix Bauer had any way of knowing that the words moving between them had been replaced entirely. She picked up the fork again and polished it with mechanical motions. She told herself she was overreacting. She told herself that translators simplified sometimes, that business German carried nuances that did not always survive transition, that there were 100 innocent explanations for what she had just heard. But she had spent 4 years working as a certified interpreter. She had translated contracts in Frankfurt and Amsterdam and Chicago. She had sat in rooms exactly like this one, rendering meaning from one language to another with the kind of precision that left no room for substitution. What Gregory had done was not simplification. It was replacement. And she knew the difference the way a surgeon knows. The difference between a bruise and a fracture. Robert responded to Gregory's false translation with visible warmth. He said he was glad Felix felt that way, that his own team had worked for weeks on the framework, and that he was confident it represented the fairest arrangement for both parties. He said he hoped they could finalize everything by the end of the evening. Gregory turned to Felix and translated. Emma listened. He told Felix that Robert was grateful for his time and hoped they could conclude their discussions quickly. He omitted the part about the weeks of work. He omitted the word fairest entirely, along with its implication of mutual benefit. What remained was a hollow courtesy that moved the conversation nowhere. It certainly did not address the objection Felix had raised. Felix nodded politely and asked his question again, this time more directly. He asked whether the penalty clause figure on page 11 of the contract matched the number from their email exchange in March, 'cause from his reading it did not. Emma's heart was pounding. She walked to table 9 under the pretense of checking the breadbasket, even though it was still more than half full. She stood close enough to hear Gregory's translation clearly. He says he's looking forward to reviewing the final copy, Gregory told Robert. Wants to make sure everything is in order before the signatures go down. Standard caution, nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. Felix Bauer had just asked a precise legal question about a discrepancy in written figures. Gregory Sloane had told Robert Calloway there was nothing to worry about. Emma walked back to the service station. Patricia appeared beside her with a tray of empty glasses. You all right? Patricia asked quietly. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, Emma said. She was not fine. She was standing in the middle of a dining room in Manhattan, holding a tray, and realizing that the woman she had tried very hard to bury for the past 3 years was not buried at all. She was wide awake, listening to every word, and she was furious. Emma thought about her mother, Diana. Lying in a bed at St. Catherine's Medical Center 3 miles away, connected to machines that cost money every single hour they ran. She thought about the apartment in Queens with the broken radiator and the rent that was due in 9 days. She thought about the 11 months she had spent learning to be invisible, learning to carry trays and smile without speaking, learning to exist in rooms like this one without anyone knowing that the woman refilling their water glasses could have been sitting at their table. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about Felix Bauer, who had flown across an ocean to sign a contract he believed was one thing, and which was quietly being turned into something else entirely. She looked at table 9. Gregory Sloane was smiling. Robert Calloway was leaning forward with the open posture of someone who believed the meeting was going well. Felix was leafing through pages of a document, his brow furrowed, looking for the answer to a question that no one in that room was giving him. Emma set down her tray. She looked at the frosted glass partition. She looked at her own reflection in it. Dark hair, white shirt, black apron. The costume of a woman who did not exist. And then she picked up the wine bottle from the service station, walked back to table 9, and began to pour. Emma poured the wine with steady hands, even though nothing inside her was steady. The burgundy liquid caught the candlelight as it moved from bottle to glass, and she kept her eyes on the pour, focused, precise. The way she had trained herself to be precise in a completely different life. She set the bottle down on the table and did not leave. Robert Calloway glanced up at her briefly the way people glance at furniture. Registering presence without registering the person, Gregory Sloane did not look at her at all. Felix Bauer was still turning pages in the contract, running his finger along lines of text, searching. Emma straightened the breadbasket that did not need straightening. She adjusted the salt cellar that was already perfectly placed. And then, because the moment had arrived, and she understood that moments like this one do not wait, she leaned toward Robert Calloway and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "Sir," she said, "your translator is not giving you accurate information." Robert turned his head slowly and looked at her. His expression did not change dramatically. Men who ran companies worth hundreds of millions learned early to keep their faces neutral when surprised, because the cost of visible surprise was often measured in dollars. "The German gentleman has asked twice now about a discrepancy in the penalty clause on page 11, Emma continued, keeping her voice at the level of a breath. "He said the figure in the contract does not match what was agreed in correspondence from March. Your translator told you, he said the framework looks solid, and that he is impressed." Robert held her gaze. "You speak German," he said. It was not a question. Fluently, Emma said. "I worked as a certified interpreter for 4 years. What your translator is doing is not simplifying. He is replacing what Mr. Bauer says with entirely different meaning." She picked up the wine bottle and stepped back exactly 1 step, resuming the posture of a waitress finished with her task. She did not look at Gregory. She did not look at Felix. She looked at a point just above Robert's left shoulder, the way she had been trained to look in rooms, where being seen fully was dangerous. Robert was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted them because counting was something to do with the part of her mind that wanted to panic. Then he picked up his wine glass, took a slow sip, and set it down. "Thank you," he said, and his voice carried nothing that would alert the others. He turned back to Gregory as Emma moved away from the table. She returned to the service station and stood with her back to the dining room. Patricia came beside her and said something about a table near the window needing dessert menus, and Emma nodded without hearing the words. Her entire attention was stretched across the room like a wire pulled taut, listening. "Gregory," Robert said pleasantly, "ask Mr. Bauer to walk me through his specific concerns about the contract. Tell him I want to hear everything, nothing left out. We have all the time we need." Gregory smiled and turned to Felix. Emma listened. To the German words that followed, Gregory asked Felix whether he was enjoying the food. Emma pressed her fingers flat against the service counter. The audacity of it was almost breathtaking. Robert had asked for a full account of Felix's concerns, and Gregory had asked about the food. Felix, visibly confused by the shift in conversation, responded politely that the meal was excellent, and then immediately returned to his point about page 11 and the March correspondence and the penalty figure that had changed. Gregory translated. "He says the food here is excellent. Very impressed with the evening overall. Thinks we're close to wrapping this up." Robert Calloway set his fork down. He did it carefully, the tines resting precisely on the edge of the plate. And Emma recognized the gesture because she had watched enough powerful people in enough expensive rooms to understand that very controlled movements were often the outward expression of very controlled fury. "Interesting," Robert said. "Because when I studied German briefly in college, I believe I heard him mention something about March. Correspondence from March." Gregory's smile remained, but something behind it flickered. "Just context," he said smoothly. "Background detail? Nothing material?" "I see," said Robert. He looked across the room and found Emma at the service station. He did not wave or call out. He simply looked at her with the clear intention of a man who had made a decision. Emma walked to table 9 for the 3rd time that evening. "I apologize for the interruption," Robert said to both men at the table, his voice carrying the polished calm of someone entirely in control of the room. "I'd like to try something different for the remainder of our conversation this evening. I'd like to ask our server to assist with translation." Gregory's composure cracked at the edges. "Mr. Calloway, that's quite unusual. I'm your designated translator for this engagement. And I can assure you, I'm sure you can," Robert said. and the pleasantness in his voice was so perfectly maintained that it was more cutting than any sharpness would have been. "But I find myself curious about a few things, and I'd like a second perspective. That's all." He looked at Emma. "Would you be willing to help us?" Emma stood at the edge of table 9 in her black apron and white shirt, with her dark hair pulled back and her hands clasped in front of her. And she thought about her mother Diana at St. Catherine's, asking for her 3 times before 6 in the morning. She thought about the rent and the broken radiator and 11 months of being invisible, and then she let go of all of it. The way you let go of a railing when you finally trust that the ground beneath you is solid? "Yes," she said. "I would." She set her tray on the service counter, removed her apron, and folded it over the back of an empty chair nearby, and sat in the 4th seat at table 9, as though she had always belonged there. Gregory stared at her with an expression that moved through disbelief and arrived at something closer to fear. Felix. Bauer looked at her with open curiosity. Emma turned to him and spoke in German, clear and direct, introducing herself by name and explaining that she would be assisting with translation for the remainder of the evening. She told him she was sorry if anything earlier in the conversation had been unclear. Felix's face changed entirely. The tension that had been building across his forehead for the past hour released in one visible exhale. He leaned forward and spoke quickly, the German coming out with the relief of a man who had been trying to push through a wall and suddenly found a door. Emma translated. Without pause, without alteration, Felix said. The penalty clause on page 11 listed a figure of $40,000 per week of delay. The figure in the email from Robert's operations director in March had been $15,000. The difference was not a rounding error. It was a restructuring of financial risk that placed nearly all liability on Felix's company in the event of any shipping disruption. He had raised this point twice during the evening and had not received a response that addressed it. He wanted to know whether Robert was aware of this discrepancy, and whether it was intentional. Emma finished translating and looked at Robert. Robert's expression was composed, but his eyes had gone very still. He looked at the contract in front of Felix, then at Gregory Sloane, and then he asked quietly, "Did you know about this discrepancy?" Gregory opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Legal German is extremely nuanced," he began. "Certain numerical contexts can be interpreted." 40,000 versus 15,000, Robert said. "Is that a nuance?" The table was silent. Felix watched the exchange between the two Americans, with the careful attention of someone who understood the emotional language of a conversation, even when the words were foreign. Robert looked at Emma. "Please tell Mr. Bauer that I was not aware of this discrepancy, that it does not reflect the agreement we reached in March, and that no contract will be signed tonight." Emma translated. Felix closed his eyes briefly and nodded, and the nod carried an entire conversation of relief and restored trust in a single movement. Robert stood from his chair and buttoned his jacket. He looked at Gregory Sloane with the measured expression of a man who has many things to say and has chosen to say none of them in a restaurant in front of a German manufacturing executive and a waitress who speaks 7 languages. "Gregory," he said, "we will speak tomorrow. Tonight is finished for you." Gregory gathered his leather folder and left without a word. The sound of his footsteps on the dining room floor was the only sound in a room that had gone. It's very quiet around table 9. Felix extended his hand across the table to Emma and said "thank you" in German, and then again in careful English, and the warmth in it was the kind that has nothing to do with business. Robert sat back down and looked at Emma across the white tablecloth. "Who are you?" he asked. Emma looked at her hands resting on the table. The same hands that had poured his wine an hour ago? "It is a long answer," she said. "I have nowhere else to be tonight," Robert replied. And so she told him. Not all of it. Not the deepest parts. But enough. She told him about growing up in a family where languages were treated as living things, where her father had worked in international trade and brought contracts home the way other fathers brought homework, where she had absorbed German and French and 2 others before she graduated high school. She told him about the 4 years she spent building a small interpreting business with a partner she trusted, a man named Dennis Hale, who had handled the business side while she handled the languages. She told him about the morning she discovered that Dennis had been falsifying translations on contracts for 2 years, directing outcomes in favor of clients who paid him privately, using her name and her credentials as the professional face of a fraud she had never known was happening. She told him about losing her license and her reputation in the same week, about the doors that closed, about her mother Diana's diagnosis arriving 6 weeks after everything else collapsed. As though the universe had decided to be thorough, she did not cry. She had cried about it enough in the 11 months between then and now. In the small apartment in Queens, after her shifts ended, in hospital corridors while waiting for doctors, in the bathroom of the Copperleaf on particularly hard evenings, she had used up the crying, and what remained was simply the shape of the story, clear and finished, like a scar that no longer hurt but would always be visible. Robert listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The man who built the fraud," he said. "Dennis Hale. Was he ever held accountable?" "He left the country," Emma said. "Somewhere in Central America is the last anyone heard. My lawyer said pursuing it internationally would cost more than I had, which by that point was almost nothing." Robert looked at the contract that still lay open on the table. Then he looked at Emma. "Tonight you could have stayed at that service station and said nothing," he said. "You had every reason to, I know," Emma said. "Why didn't you?" Emma thought about Felix Bauer, turning pages in a contract, looking for an answer that kept not coming. She thought about what it felt like to discover that someone had been speaking in your name and saying things you never said. "I know what it costs when no one tells you the truth in time," she said. Robert reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a business card on the table. It was cream-colored with raised lettering, and it sat between them like a small, quiet invitation. "Come to my office tomorrow morning," he said. "Not as a favor. I need someone I can trust in a room where multiple languages are spoken, and tonight you proved that person exists. I would like to talk about what that could look like." Emma looked at the card. She did not pick it up yet. "My name is still associated with a fraud case," she said. "If that becomes public in connection with your company—" "My company nearly signed a fraudulent contract tonight because I trusted the wrong person," Robert said. "I think we've established that a name on a document tells you very little about who someone actually is." Emma picked up the card. The raised letters pressed into her fingertips. She slid it into the pocket of her folded apron and stood from the chair. "I will think about it," she said. "That is all I am asking," Robert replied. She picked up her apron, walked back to the service station, and stood very still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Patricia appeared beside her with the expression of someone who had been watching from across the room and had approximately 40 questions. "Not tonight," Emma said quietly. And Patricia, who was a good friend above all things, nodded and said nothing. Emma finished her shift. She cleared tables and stacked glasses and wiped down the service station and did everything a waitress does at the end of an evening in a restaurant where the candles cost more than her hourly wage. And when she finally walked out into the cool Manhattan night and stood on the pavement with the city moving around her, she put her hand in her apron pocket and felt the edge of the business card and held it there without taking it out. Above her, the buildings rose against a sky orange with reflected light. And somewhere 3 miles away, her mother Diana was sleeping in a hospital bed. And somewhere in this same city, a man named Robert Calloway was probably sitting in the back of a car thinking about a contract that had nearly cost him everything. Emma walked to the subway and rode it home. And for the first time in 11 months, she did not feel like she was disappearing. Emma arrived at St. Catherine's Medical Center at 7:15 in the morning with 2 coffees from the diner on the corner, one for herself and one for the nurse at the front desk named Carol, who had been kind to her mother on the difficult nights. The corridor smelled the way hospital corridors always smell, like cleanliness, working very hard against something it cannot fully defeat. And Emma walked it the way she always walked it, with her eyes forward and her steps measured, because hurrying in hospital corridors felt like inviting bad news to keep pace with you. Diana Hartwell was awake. She was sitting up against her pillows with her reading glasses on and a crossword puzzle open on her lap. which she was not doing. She was looking at the window where the early morning light came through in thin, pale strips. And when Emma appeared in the doorway, her face rearranged itself into the particular kind of happiness that belongs only to mothers who have been worried and are now relieved. Look different, Diana said before Emma had even sat down. I look exactly the same, Emma said, kissing her mother's forehead and taking the chair beside the bed. You look like yourself, Diana said, which was not the same thing at all. They both understood that. Emma told her everything while the morning light grew stronger in the window. She told it plainly in the order it happened, without softening the parts that were frightening and without exaggerating the parts that felt important. Diana listened the way she had always listened, with her full attention and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on her daughter's face, reading not just the words but the space between them. When Emma finished, Diana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the card is in your pocket right now." Emma smiled. "Yes, and you have been talking yourself out of using it since last night." "Also yes." Diana removed her glasses and set them on the crossword puzzle she had not touched. "Tell me the argument against," she said. "The real one, not the one about your name being tarnished. You know that one does not hold." Emma looked at her hands. "What if I am not that person anymore?" she said. "What if I spent 11 months learning to be small, and now the large version of me does not fit anywhere?" Diana was quiet for a moment. Outside in the corridor, a cart rolled past with a sound like distant thunder. "Do you remember when you were 9 years old and we moved from Chicago to Stuttgart?" She said, "Of course. You cried for 2 weeks. You told me you had forgotten how to be yourself." In German, because it had been so long since we lived somewhere German was spoken every day. Anna's. The voice was the particular gentle sort that carried no sentimentality, only truth. "And then one morning you woke up and came to breakfast and started talking, and you never stopped. You had not forgotten. You had simply been waiting for the right room." Emma felt the tightness in her throat that she had learned to recognize as the feeling that arrived just before something shifted. Robert Calloway might be the wrong room, she said, but her voice had already lost its conviction. "He might be," Diana agreed, "but a wrong room is still a room, and a room is still a chance to remember your own voice." Emma's phone buzzed on the chair beside her. She looked at the screen. An unknown number, but a Manhattan area code. She answered. The man on the other end introduced himself as Thomas Reeves, legal counsel for Calloway Industries. His voice was measured and professional and moved quickly to the point. He said that Robert Calloway had asked him to reach out because the investigation that had begun the previous evening had produced significant findings. And Mr. Calloway felt Emma deserved to know what had been discovered before she made any decision about the offer that had been extended to her. Emma stood and moved to the window. Below her, the city was beginning its morning in earnest. Taxis and delivery trucks and people in coats walking fast. Thomas Reeves told her that Gregory Sloane was not a qualified interpreter. His credentials came from a language program that had closed for fraudulent certification practices 3 years earlier. His German was conversational at best, adequate for ordering food in Munich, but nowhere near sufficient for legal and commercial translation. He had been recommended to Calloway Industries by a board member named Howard Sloane, who was Gregory's uncle and who held a 7% stake in a shell company that stood to benefit substantially from the altered contract terms. The $40,000 weekly penalty clause, if the contract had been signed, would have been paid into an escrow account that ultimately flowed to that shell company through 2 intermediaries. Howard Sloane had been building this scheme for 8 months. Emma pressed her free hand flat against the cold glass of the window. How much was at stake? She asked, conservatively, in the event of shipping disruptions over the contract period. Somewhere between $2 and $4 million, Thomas said. Mr. Calloway's company would have paid it to an entity controlled by one of his own board members, facilitated by a fraudulent interpreter, and Mr. Bauer's company in Munich would have been held to terms they never agreed to. Emma thought about Gregory Sloane's narrow smile across the dinner table. She thought about the ease of it, the practiced smoothness, the way he had converted Felix Bauer's careful objections Into enthusiasm and compliance with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this before, she thought about Dennis Hale, who had smiled exactly the same way. "Is Mr. Calloway taking legal action?" she asked, against both Gregory and Howard Sloan. "Yes. The board is convening an emergency session this morning. Mr. Calloway wanted me to convey to you that none of this would have come to light in time without what you did last night, and that his offer stands with full knowledge of your history and full confidence in your integrity." Emma thanked him and ended the call. She stood at the window for a moment longer. Then she went back and sat beside her mother and told her the rest of it. The shell company and Howard Sloan and the $2 to $4 million that had almost moved in silence. Through a dinner in a restaurant where she had been pouring wine, Diana listened and said nothing until Emma was finished. Then she said, "Your father used to say that the people who build false bridges are counting on everyone else to stay on the bank." "I remember." Emma said, "You did not stay on the bank last night." "No." Diana reached across and took her daughter's hand with the grip that had always felt stronger than it looked. The grip of someone who had held on to things through a great deal and did not intend to stop. "Go," she said simply. Emma squeezed her mother's hand. She stood. She kissed Diana's forehead again, smoothed the blanket across her legs, and picked up her bag. At the door she stopped and looked back. Diana had already put her glasses on and picked up the crossword puzzle, but she was smiling at it in a way that had nothing to do with the clues. Emma took the subway to the financial district and came up from underground into a morning that had turned clear and cold and bright. The buildings around her caught the sun on their glass faces and threw it in all directions, and she walked through it with her bag over her shoulder and the business card in her hand. Not in her pocket anymore, in her hand, which was a different thing entirely. She found the building. 40 stories of steel and glass with Calloway Industries in clean letters above the revolving door. She pushed through into a lobby of pale marble and high ceilings, where the sound of footsteps arrived and departed in all directions. Like a language she already knew, the receptionist looked up. Emma said her name and said she was there to see Robert Calloway, that he was expecting her. The receptionist made the call. Emma waited and did not count the seconds. This time, because she had stopped needing to measure time by the unit of her own endurance. 12th floor. "Miss Hartwell, Mr. Calloway is ready for you." The elevator was all mirrors, and Emma stood in the center of it and looked at herself plainly. No apron, no name tag. Dark hair loose around her shoulders. The way she had worn it in another life when she walked into conference rooms in Frankfurt and Amsterdam and Chicago and opened her mouth and let 7 languages do the work they were built to do. The elevator opened. Robert Calloway was standing in the corridor. Not behind a desk, not in a chair, standing in the corridor with his jacket open and his expression carrying the particular quality of someone who is genuinely glad to see a person arrive. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the night before when she sat down at table 9, not with surprise. "With recognition, you came," he said. "Came," Emma said. He walked beside her down the corridor toward his office. And as they walked, he said that Thomas Reeves would join them in 20 minutes, that Felix Bauer had already called from Munich that morning to say he was prepared to restart the negotiation from the beginning with full trust in the process, and that Robert wanted Emma present for every meeting from this point forward, in whatever capacity made sense to her, consultant, staff, interpreter, or something they had not yet named. Emma looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city, spreading out below the 12th floor in every direction. Rooftops and water towers and bridges, catching the morning sun. "I should tell you something," she said. "Tell me," Robert said. "I am not the person I was 4 years ago," Emma said. "That person had certainty. I have something smaller than that right now. I have the decision to try. That is genuinely all I can offer at this moment." Robert stopped walking and looked at her. The morning light came through the window behind him and made the silver at his temples look like something deliberate, like a feature rather than an accident of time. 4 years ago I had a company with 1 location and 12 employees, he said. Certainty was not what built it. The decision to try was what built it. Every single morning, made again from the beginning. He paused. I think we will work well together, Emma. Emma looked at him for a moment and felt something she recognized from a long time ago. Not the flutter of romance, not yet. It was too early and too careful for that. But the quieter and perhaps more durable feeling of being seen accurately by another person and not needing to correct their impression of you. I think we might, she said. They walked the rest of the corridor to his office, and Thomas Reeves arrived 8 minutes later with a folder of documents and a pot of very good coffee. And the morning opened in front of them like a conversation that had a great deal left to say. In a room at St. Catherine's 3 miles away, Diana Hartwell finished her crossword puzzle, set it on the nightstand, and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally, carefully set it down. Emma Hartwell did not rebuild her life that morning. Rebuilding takes longer than a morning, and she knew that better than most. But she began it, which is the only part that has to happen first, and sometimes the beginning is everything.